See. So far we have this login page that is being backed by a controller that is handling the login button and doing searches on some local data store that it has. Okay, and so right now if we type some bogus value, it comes up with some error, or if we type in the right data, it greets us. All right. Okay. So let's keep going. We've implemented the template right here in the login view client.html, and we've implemented the controller here in app.js. Right. Now, usually it's a better practice to have controllers be in their own file. Right. Imagine we're going to have fair amount of number of controllers. We don't want them all here in this file, right? Each one of them is going to handle several events, right? Each one is going to have a lot of business logic in one of these. So this is not a feasible way of implementing this, right? So instead, what we're going to do is that we're going to grab this and copy it into its own directory, right? So we're going to move this into its own controllers directory. Right, controllers, because we're going to have not just one controller, we're going to have quite a few controllers. We're going to grab app.js, we're going to move it in here, and we're going to call that this is the login.controller.view, meaning that this is an artifact that belongs to the browser, right? That's going to execute on the browser, and its role is to shuffle data back and forth between the view and the data model, right? And also handle any events that the user can generate. Right? It has a very, very specific role. Just like the view has a very specific role of rendering data for the user. Its role is not to interpret any event handlers. It's not to interpret any data. It's just to render it, to display it. Right? It doesn't know anything else. Right? So there we go. So let's put it in there. But in here, the only difference here is that by the time we get to this controller, hopefully the module already exists, right? Somebody else has created the module, right? Here, we're only retrieving the module that has been already declared. I'm only adding this controller, right, to the framework, okay? Other than that, is going to work just like it is, right? That's the only difference. And the app.js is no longer going to declare the controller. Right, no longer declaring the controller. Its only responsibility is to declare the module and any other dependencies that there might be, right? To build the application based on several other dependencies. Right now, we don't have any dependencies, right? Right here, there's this empty array says that we have no dependencies, but we're going to be adding dependencies as this grows over time. Yes. Right, so the only thing that this app.js is doing is just declaring the module, right? And then somewhere else the controller is reading the module that has already been declared and just adding a controller to that module. Yes? All right. So we need to change the implementation here. Not only do we have app.js, after that we need the controller, and the controller lives where? It lives under controllers. And then we have the login controller. Okay. If we refresh our page, notice that it works just the same, right? It behaves exactly the same way. Right, so we have Bob, login. A couple more other things of best practices. Here we have the function, and this is the event handler, right? It's handling the event of having clicked on that button, right? Right now we only have just that one event, right? But imagine that usually there might be several buttons and different things that the user can do on the page. You can add, you can remove, you can update things. So this is this implementation. It's a little hard to read, right? Especially if you have many different event handlers. Okay. So if you had several event handlers, a better solution would be to write a function, explicitly create a function that is then referred to it by the event handler. Right? So here's the declaration of the event handler, which is referencing an actual function down below. It's implemented down below. And you might have more than just one event handler. You might have 3, 4, 5 event handlers, all declared towards the top, right? And then down below you have all the functions that actually implement the event handlers, right? That way, somebody who wants to look at your controller can open it up and right away see that there's one event handler here, right? Or 5 or 6 or 10 event handlers and see what they are immediately, right? If they want to look at the implementation, they can scroll down and see the implementation. But I'm not forced, right, to scroll through the entire source code looking for the event handlers, right? What event handlers are you implementing? Make sense? It's only a nice way to just organize your code to make it easier for everybody else who's reading your code. All right, especially the TAs and myself. All right, that's one thing, right? And if we rework this, the controller still works, right? The other best practice is that scope, especially if right now we only have just one controller, okay? But it's very common in more complex pages that you might have several views, maybe a chat, a little window here that's handling the view for that little chat as you interact with something, maybe a little video that's playing over here, maybe some messages that are scrolling above the top, each one with its own controller, okay? The main view perhaps, and the main view might have maybe a separate list of the websites and a controller for that, and then an editor controller for the main. So you can have different views, each one with its own controller, and on the same page. Okay. So oftentimes this scope over here, it's not exactly clear who that scope belongs to. Okay. Which controller is that? Right. Which view is passing you that scope? Who are you bound to exactly? Okay. Especially if you have a controller that is nested inside of another controller, right? If for instance this over here, see this message over here, right? That's a variable. Yeah, who declared that variable? Who's responsible for feeding the data into that variable? Right? Especially if you have a controller within a controller within a controller. Which is the controller that is feeding the data for this particular variable? It's not entirely unambiguous, right? Who is feeding the data into this variable, right? So usually it's a best practice to namespace your variables, right? To explicitly say who's responsible for providing that data, okay? To do that, ideally you would say that is the login controller, or give a name to your controller, right? Give a name to the controller that can then be used inside of your view, right? To then specify exactly where it's coming from. A very common name for reference is to use the keyword model, right? And it's the lowercase model, the little model, not the big model, as in references and pointers and foreign keys and primary keys, not that big model, right? Little model. So the best practice is not to use the scope at all, right? Because again, this scope can be a nested scope, right? If you have many controllers on the same page, right? It could be a lot of people can be accessing that scope. So instead of binding variables and functions, right? These variables and these functions, binding them to the scope. No, it's a best practice to narrow, right, the scope and say, hey, only this controller is responsible for feeding you the data, right? Not anybody out there, right? So to do that, we're not going to use the scope anymore, right? Instead, we're going to declare a local variable that is bound to the current instance of the controller, and we're going to bind all the data and all the functions to the instance of the controller instead. Okay? So instead of a scope, instead of putting the login function binding it to the scope, we're going to bind it to the instance of the controller. Right? And instead of binding this variable message to the scope, we're going to bind it to the local instance of the controller. Okay. Now, if you go back and you rerun this, right, you'll notice that none of this works anymore, right? Because as far as the view is concerned, that login function, it's declaring that it's referring to the login function that is declared on the scope, but the scope is not even being used. We didn't use the scope to declare the login function, right? It's declared on the controller instance, not on the scope. So it's not finding it. It says there is no login function on the scope, so it's not working. Yes. So we need to tell the view. We need to tell the view that, hey, I want you to instead to bind this on bind it instead of the scope. I want you to use instead the instance of the controller, right? The instance of the controller. To do that, Angular provides a key, a syntax, so that you can refer to the instance of the controller by name, right? Giving it a name, all right? And here we can give it the name, whatever name we want. Okay. Here we're referring to the instance of the controller. We're referring to as the model variable, right? Commonly, we would use the same variable, but it doesn't have to be, right? It doesn't have to be. But a common thing to do is to use the same name, right? It doesn't have to be. It could be maybe a VM, like a view model, right? A model that only makes sense in this little page here, right, or in this little view, right? And then we can refer to it. So this would be vm.message, right, and vm.login, right? If we do that, this works again, right? Now all those variables are bound to the instance of the controller as opposed to the scope, right? So what we're doing is we're narrowing the scope, which is a good practice in general, right? As opposed to letting other controllers upstream in higher scopes, right, mock with your data, right? Scopes in controllers behave like scopes in other languages, right? Variables in lower scope and variables in higher scopes are available in lower scopes, right? If you declare X at a higher scope, right, the lower scopes also see X, right? If I can't find it in my local scope, I look for that variable in a higher scope. If I can't find that, if I can't find it in the higher scope, I'll just go up the scope until I find the declaration of the variable, right? Okay, and it's almost like treating global variables, right? And we know that global variables in general is not a good idea, right? So it's always a good idea to, as much as possible, to narrow your scope and make sure that you control the access to the data back and forth yourself, as opposed to using some kind of explicit mechanism, right? That things are bound to just higher scopes. Make sense? All right. So that's a good practice. Everybody okay? All right. Yes.
So why don't we change the username and password to VM to username?
Well, so these are bound to the scope, right? To the view scope. They're not bound to the controller. Notice that this is a better solution, right? We are deciding how the data that is declared locally on this page is being passed to the controller, right? As opposed to using the scope. This variable right here, password and username, are actually available on the scope, $scope. So actually, there was no need for passing this, right? That's a really good question. There was no need to pass these arguments, right? Because those variables were already available in the scope, right? Login using what you're saying, there was no need for me to pass this. I could have just said $scope, right, and $password, right? But notice how this now becomes even worse, right? It's not functional, right? You're not relying on an API, right? You're relying on some side effect of somebody changing the value of a variable that you somehow have access to here, right? And in general, that is a bad practice, right? To rely on some side effects, right? Like global variables, right? Global variables introduce all these side effects that you're not aware of who changed this value, who's responsible for feeding this data. You want to have control over that, right? And that's why in general we prefer, right, to use arguments, right? I pass you exactly what you need and nothing else. Right? You don't have access to anything else unless I pass it to you explicitly. Yes? Right, using a very well-defined API. Yep. All right. Okay. All right, so let's grow this a little bit. We need to be able to, if indeed we are successful at logging in, we don't want to stay in the login page, right? We want to navigate to another page, right? So we would want to leave this page, right, and display instead the website list, right? Now the problem with accessing the website list is that we can't navigate away from this, right? Because it's a single page application. So what do? Right? We cannot navigate away. We can't, go, website something website list or wherever we put it, wherever it ended up. Actually, where did it go? Website? Yeah, there it is. Website. So this is where would want to navigate, right? But we don't. We can't allow this where we're a single page application. We need to somehow feed it in, right? So let's work on that. So to work on that, we're going to need to refactor the entire navigation mechanism here, right? What we want to be able to do is load. Actually, we just ended one concept. Let me save this video and then we'll start the routing, right?